Hello G2 and welcome to the first talk on our new series on 2 Corinthians. We live in a world that is increasingly obsessed with power, or at the very least the propagation of power, with politicians who are obsessed with telling us that they are going to make Britain strong again, or make Britain great again, I worry. But we also know that for all of the talk of power and strength and prosperity, it isn't reflective of the ordinary lives of people in this country. What we know is that since 2022, the bottom fifth of the UK's population's real wage has fallen by 7%, whereas for the richest fifth, it's gone up by 7.8%. What we know is that billionaires are getting more rich, but we know that for families up and down this country, more and more are relying on food banks. What we know is that internationally, there are more wars, and there is more isolation from countries, and that development is being cut and it's having devastating consequences. What we know is we are living in the aftermath of years upon years of austerity and public service cuts. And it feels like our services and what we rely on don't seem to work in the way that they did before. I'm talking in the midst of the flag protests. So if you look around you, you are seeing more and more flags popping up and down the country and in our city. If you've driven down Hull Road, it looks like the mall in London. They seem to be absolutely everywhere. And what we're seeing is some really quite ugly and disturbing scenes. In London over the weekend, we saw some awful racism and extremism, some really quite disgusting scenes and actions from people. And I wonder about the link between the two. I wonder, in a culture, in a society that is increasingly broken and fragile and insecure, there are those kinds of conversations in the cultural conversations of whose voice is being heard, who in this country is looked after, who feels like they're being left behind, whose voice is being honoured. I wonder if we're seeing in the flag protests and the fervour of anger behind that a link between an economic model that doesn't feel like it's working for people and the rising inequality and difficulties and fractiousness we are seeing through that spilling into some of our cultural volcanoes we see. The point is, I suppose, we live in an increasingly broken world. Now, it may feel like an odd place to start for our series on 2 Corinthians. However, I want to draw the comparison between that and our increasing sense of a lack of hope for the future and what Paul is writing into in 1st century Corinth. 2 Corinthians is a letter that Paul wrote to the people of Corinth at the time, and Corinth was a major trading port. But that wealth that the trading port created didn't distribute into the city. We know that Corinth was a multicultural place, but there were increasingly competing voices about what success looked like. There was a myriad of forces and narratives around what success was and whether this was working for the people at the time. What we know is their church was caught between these forces and increasingly turned to so-called super apostles to try and solve it. We know that these super apostles stood with quite a lot of certainty and confidence, declaring, I have got the answer. And we know that Paul goes on to say that they really, really didn't. I wonder if there's a link to our society of leaders standing up with common sense solutions saying, I've got the answer, and we look at them with a bit of scepticism. And what we know is that in the letter that Paul wrote to the people of Corinth, he didn't stand there with that same physicality of put-togetherness and certainty. But Paul says himself he wasn't that impressive a bloke. We know that he was often ill. We know that he didn't feel like he really met the match. And I guess what we want to explore through this series is a link between our brokenness and the brokenness of the society around us, and what does the gospel speak into that fragility. Paul has credibility when he talks about fragility and he talks about struggle. In chapter 11, Paul details beatings, hunger, danger, prison, and a shipwreck as things that he's faced and had to go through. He talks about a thorn in the flesh, some form of painful weakness in his spiritual journey that he wants God to remove. We know that even at the start of 2 Corinthians, Paul says that he despaired for his life. We know that Paul experienced struggle, he experienced fragility, he experienced insecurity. But we also know in chapter 4 that Paul says, we are hard pressed on every side, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but we are not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. So when Sashin and I met up for their series and thought about it and prayed about it and wrote it, that was their message that we wanted to get through. How can we have gospel strength in the struggle, in the brokenness? How can we understand more so that the gospel's power is made perfect through fragility and weaknesses? In chapter 12, it says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul writes about how God's grace is sufficient for us. So we're in a society that is constantly telling us that we need to put away our weaknesses and stand strong and keep up appearances and look successful. Paul's message to us is that we need to bring those weaknesses into the light, because that's where we understand more about God's grace. And I guess that will be the structure for this series. We're going to look first at comfort. God comforts us in our times of trouble, so we can go on to comfort others. We'll look at how the treasure of the gospel is carried in us as vessels that are fragile, in jars of clay. We'll look at how we can have faith in uncertainty, and in how we can have generosity in times when resources are scarce. We'll look at how we can be gentle, and what does gentleness look like in a world that is propagating anger and image. And then we'll return to our theme of grace and its sufficiency for us. How is gospel's power made perfect? And what does it look like for us to have gospel strength in struggle? Paul doesn't want us to pretend. He doesn't ask us to pretend. He doesn't want us to fake strength. He wants us to bring our scars and our struggles and our fragility. I think we all want to look strong and to put on the armour and the image and the mask, I suppose, of a lack of being fazed by the world around us. That things are all right, that things aren't difficult when things may be. And I think this is a trap I fall into. And it's something I've learned, and it's something that I feel challenged on. That when things are hard, it's all right to present that, and it's all right to invite people into that. So I guess the challenge is to join in. Let's bring our whole selves into this series, which at times may feel vulnerable and may feel really quite difficult. But as we bring our hopes and our fears, our strengths and our difficulties, we will recognise more about God's grace and how this manifests and how it's accentuated through the things that are difficult. Maybe we as a church in 21st century Britain need the same lesson that they had in 1st century Corinth. Maybe we can live differently in the broken world around us as we are broken people. Maybe we can understand more so that it is through our difficulties and through our fragility and through the nightmares that we see around us, that is where the redemption and the hope and the power that the gospel message has and the power that God has is made perfect.